The wind howled through the Texas plains, rattling the shutters of the Grand Whitmore estate like a restless spirit demanding escape. Inside, Evelyn Whitmore stood motionless in the dim candlelight of her bedroom, her fingers clenched around the edges of a pack satchel. She could hear them below, her father's gruff voice, the slow, deliberate drawl of Mr. Carver, the man who would soon call her his wife. She had no illusions about what that meant. Carver wasn't just twice her age. He was cruel, hardened by years of claiming what he wanted without question. A cattle baron with a reputation for breaking men under his boot and taking wives the way he took land. She'd seen the way his hands lingered on the armrests of his chair, the slight smirk whenever her father spoke of the arrangement, like she wasn't in the room. A business deal sealed with a wedding vow. Evelyn knew if she let that happen, she would never be free again. Her breath came sharp as she moved, every step across the floorboards careful, deliberate. The leather satchel was light, filled only with what she could carry. A flask of water, a knife taken from the kitchen, a bundle of food wrapped in cloth, and a few silver coins. Enough, she hoped, to survive. The dress she wore, a simple riding outfit rather than the elaborate silks she was expected to favor, clung to her like a second skin. She would need to ride fast, and dresses with endless skirts were only good for getting caught in the stirrups. Outside, the night was thick and moonless, her only advantage. She eased the window open, cold air stinging her skin as she swung one leg over the sill, then the other, dropping soundlessly into the garden below. The scent of wet earth filled her nostrils, the roses in full bloom, their petals ghostly in the faint light. She didn't pause to breathe it in. Every second mattered. Moving through the estate's back path, she pressed herself against the side of the stables, heart hammering in her chest. The stable boy, young and forever half asleep, had finished his nightly rounds. Good. She slipped inside, whispering a soft hush to the horses, their ears twitching at her presence. She had no time to saddle one properly. She grabbed the nearest mount's bridle, a sturdy chestnut mare, and swung herself up bareback. The moment she kicked the horse into motion, the quiet shattered. A voice rang out from the main house. A window slammed open. Light flared as a lantern was lifted. "She's gone? She's running." Shouts erupted. The front door banged against the wall, heavy boots pounding across the porch. Evelyn clenched the reins tighter and leaned forward as the mare bolted toward the open plains, her hooves kicking up dirt. Behind her, the barking of dogs split the night, followed by the unmistakable crack of a rifle shot. The bullet hit the dirt beside her, spraying dust against her leg. She didn't look back. The land stretched before her, endless and unforgiving. The ranch's boundary fence was a jagged line in the distance, barely visible in the dark. If she could reach it before Carver's men mounted up, she might have a chance. Her mare was swift, but so were the thoroughbreds Carver owned. If they caught up to her, she knew exactly what would happen. Evelyn urged the horse faster. Wind tore at her face, strands of loose hair whipping behind her. The landscape blurred. Dry riverbeds, rolling hills, patches of mesquite. The terrain was rough, but she had spent her life riding. She could handle rough. What she couldn't handle was the sound of hoofbeats closing in. Her pulse roared in her ears. They were gaining. She could hear them now, 3, maybe 4 riders. She stole a glance over her shoulder. Lantern light flickered against the darkness, illuminating their figures as they pushed their horses harder. Carver's men, armed and relentless. The fence was near. 30 yards. 20. The mare's muscles coiled beneath her as Evelyn braced. Then, just as she reached the threshold, the horse gave a sharp, startled cry and stumbled. The world spun as Evelyn lost her grip. She hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the breath from her lungs. The horse tumbled, rolling dangerously close before scrambling to its feet and bolting into the night. Pain shot up her arm. She pushed through it, forcing herself up. No time. She was on foot now, and her pursuers were almost upon her. Panic clawed at her throat, but she willed it down. Her eyes darted wildly across the terrain. To the east, open land, no cover. To the west, the jagged silhouette of rocky outcrops leading into Apache territory. She hesitated only a second before running west. The uneven ground made every step treacherous, her boots slipping against loose stones. The sound of the riders behind her grew louder. They were close. She could hear their voices now. She went down. Find her. Evelyn pushed herself harder. Her breath came in ragged gasps. Shadows stretched across the terrain, jagged and merciless. Somewhere ahead, the rocks formed a natural pass, a narrow gap between the cliffs. If she could reach it, maybe, just maybe, she could lose them. She didn't slow as she reached the entrance, forcing herself into the tight passage, just as another shot rang out. The bullet struck the stone beside her, fragments cutting across her cheek. Too close. The passage wound deeper into the cliffs, darkness swallowing her whole. She ran blind, arms outstretched to keep from slamming into the walls. Her lungs burned, her legs ached, but she kept moving. Behind her, the voices of her pursuers echoed. She's in the rocks. She won't get far. She wasn't sure they were wrong. The further she ran, the steeper the incline became, the jagged terrain tearing at her hands as she scrambled upward. She could feel her strength slipping. She needed to hide, to find a place to vanish into the darkness before they caught up. Then, ahead, the terrain shifted. The passage widened, opening into a small, moonlit clearing surrounded by sheer cliffs. A dead end. No. Evelyn turned, heart slamming against her ribs. A sound made her freeze. Not the voices of her pursuers. Something else. Low. Measured. Breathing. Her pulse stilled. From the shadows, a figure moved. Tall. Silent. Watching. The faint glint of a blade at his side. An Apache warrior. Evelyn's breath hitched in her throat as the figure stepped from the shadows. Moonlight painted the sharp angles of his face, high cheekbones, a strong jaw, and dark, calculating eyes that held no warmth. He stood motionless, the lean muscles of his arms coiled with quiet strength. A blade hung at his hip, worn but well-kept, and a rifle rested across his back. Apache. Her body went rigid. She had heard the stories. Whispered rumors passed between settlers over flickering lanterns, of warriors who moved like ghosts through the desert, who struck without warning and vanished before dawn. She didn't know how much of it was truth and how much was fear-driven myth, but standing before him now, she realized none of it mattered. He was real, and he was watching her. The moment stretched thin. Evelyn willed herself not to move, her pulse hammering beneath her ribs. Behind her, the voices of her pursuers echoed through the canyon walls, their torches flickering like dying stars against the night. If she ran, she would be seen. If she stayed, she didn't know what would happen. The warrior tilted his head slightly, his gaze flicking past her to the passage she had just come through. He could hear them too. His fingers tightened around the handle of his knife, but he didn't draw it. He didn't speak, didn't move closer, only observed her as if deciding whether she was worth his time. A gust of wind swept through the canyon, carrying the scent of burning wood. The men were close. Evelyn swallowed hard and did the only thing she could. She raised her hands slowly, palms out, a universal gesture of surrender. He said nothing, but his expression shifted ever so slightly. A flicker of something unreadable. A snap of twigs behind her made her heart lurch. She turned, spotting the first of Carver's men entering the pass, his lantern casting long, jagged shadows against the rock. Her body tensed, every nerve screaming at her to run. But she had nowhere left to go. A whisper of movement. Evelyn barely had time to register the warrior stepping past her before he was gone, melding into the darkness like smoke. One moment he was there, the next he wasn't. The man with the lantern turned, scanning the canyon. His voice was low and edged with frustration. "You see anything?" Another man stepped into view. "No." The tracks lead through here, but I don't see her. Evelyn pressed herself against the rock wall, breath shallow, willing herself to be invisible. The two men muttered curses, their boots crunching against the gravel. Then one of them paused. Wait. What if she's not alone? Evelyn stiffened. The other man scoffed. Ain't no one out here but ghosts. A flash of steel in the dark. The first man barely had time to gasp before something dragged him backward into the shadows. The second turned, mouth opening to shout, but a hand clamped over his throat, and in one fluid motion, he was gone, too. Silence. Evelyn's pulse pounded as she stared into the blackness, where they had vanished. A muffled struggle, a sharp exhale, then nothing. She couldn't breathe. A shape emerged from the darkness, moving with eerie calm. The warrior stepped back into the moonlight, his expression unreadable. Blood marred the blade in his hand, but he showed no sign of exertion, no sign of hesitation. Evelyn swallowed hard, her throat dry as dust. He had saved her, or killed them for his own reasons. She didn't know which was worse. The warrior met her gaze, his face impassive. Then, without a word, he turned and began walking away, deeper into the canyon. He didn't look back. Evelyn hesitated. She could try to find her own way out. Alone, lost in a land she didn't understand, with Carver's men still hunting her, with the desert stretching out in endless, merciless miles. Or she could follow the man who had just saved her life. A man she didn't trust. A man who, for reasons she couldn't yet grasp, had chosen not to let her die. Her feet moved before her mind caught up. She followed him into the dark. The night swallowed them whole as they moved through the canyon, the warrior leading without a word. Evelyn followed, her breath uneven, her mind spinning with questions she dared not ask. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and sage, the distant cries of coyotes echoing against the cliffs. Each step away from the bodies she left behind sent a shiver through her. She had seen death before, sickness, accidents on the ranch, but not like this. Not so silent. Not so absolute. The warrior moved like a shadow, his steps soundless, his presence both reassuring and unnerving. He had saved her life, but that did not mean she was safe. She knew nothing about him, nothing of his intentions. He had not spoken, not even after she followed, as if acknowledging her would make her his responsibility. She was not sure he wanted that. Evelyn pressed her fingers to the cut on her cheek, wincing as the sting reminded her that this was real. Her escape, the pursuit, the two men who would not be returning to Carver. She had burned every bridge behind her. There was no going back. Hours passed in silence. The only sounds the crunch of gravel beneath their feet and the occasional rustle of unseen creatures in the brush. Her legs ached, her throat raw from thirst, but she said nothing. She did not know if speaking would anger him, or if he would even understand. She had heard bits of Apache spoken before, but she could not form a single word of it. As the terrain grew rougher, the canyon walls gave way to open desert, vast and unyielding beneath the star-choked sky. The warrior came to an abrupt stop near a low ridge, scanning the horizon before crouching near a cluster of brush. He gestured sharply with his chin, and it took her a moment to understand. He wanted her to sit. Evelyn obeyed, lowering herself onto the cool earth as he moved to gather wood. He worked quickly, stripping kindling from the dry scrub, his hands efficient, practiced. Within moments, a small fire crackled between them, the flames casting flickering shadows against the rocks. She watched as he pulled a water skin from his belt and took a slow drink before tossing it toward her. She caught it awkwardly, her fingers fumbling against the rough leather. Hesitating only a moment, she brought it to her lips, the water warm but welcome as it soothed the dryness in her throat. The silence stretched. Finally, she found her voice. "What's your name?" The warrior didn't look at her. He sat across the fire, his legs folded beneath him, sharpening his blade with slow, deliberate strokes. For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, without pausing his work, he spoke. Kai. His voice was low, edged with something she couldn't quite place. A hardness, perhaps. Or a warning. She held onto the name like a fragile thing. Kai, she repeated, as if saying it aloud might make it real. She hesitated, then placed a hand over her chest. Evelyn? He did not react. She exhaled, watching the fire dance between them. Do you speak much English? Kai's blade glinted, as he turned it in his hands. Enough. Not much, then. Her fingers tightened around the waterskin. Why did you help me? He stopped sharpening for the briefest moment, then resumed. I did not help you. Evelyn frowned. You saved my life. Kai's dark eyes flicked up, meeting hers across the fire. No, he said simply. I killed men who were too loud. The word sent a chill through her, not because they were cruel, but because they were honest. He had not acted out of kindness. He had acted because it was convenient, because those men had been a threat to him, to her, perhaps even to the land itself. She swallowed hard. And now, he considered her for a long moment before finally saying, Now, you are still loud. Evelyn huffed a dry, humorless laugh. I'll take that as I don't know what to do with you yet. Kai said nothing. She pulled her knees to her chest, exhaustion creeping over her in heavy waves. She wanted to sleep, but the fire, the man across from her, the weight of everything that had happened, kept her rigid with unease. Kai watched her closely, studying her in the way a man studies a creature he does not yet understand. Then, without a word, he reached into a pouch at his side and tossed something toward her. She caught it instinctively. A piece of dried meat. It wasn't much, but it was food. Evelyn met his gaze, waiting for some explanation. There was none. He simply returned to sharpening his blade, uninterested in her gratitude or her hesitation. Slowly, she bit into the meat, chewing carefully, the salty taste grounding her. It wasn't just food. It was an answer of sorts. He didn't know what to do with her. But for now, he wasn't going to let her die. It wasn't trust. Not yet. But it was something. The night stretched long, and the fire burned low. Evelyn barely slept, her body exhausted, but her mind alert to every sound, every movement. Kai remained still, sitting with his back against a boulder, his rifle balanced across his lap, eyes closed, but never truly at rest. Even in sleep, he was like a coiled predator, watching, waiting. By the time dawn bled across the horizon, the air was heavy with an unnatural stillness. Something had changed. Kai sensed it first, his body tensing before he opened his eyes. Evelyn saw it in the slight tilt of his head, the way his fingers flexed against the rifle. Then she heard it, distant hoofbeats. Slow, measured. The fire had burned down to embers, their camp hidden in the deep recess of the canyon. But it wouldn't matter. They had been found. Evelyn's stomach twisted. She knew who it was. Carver. Kai stood in one fluid motion, pulling his rifle to his shoulder and stepping toward the edge of the ridge, peering down into the valley below. Evelyn crept beside him, her breath coming fast and shallow. 5 riders. Carver rode at the front, his frame imposing even from a distance, his long coat flaring in the wind like the wings of some dark carrion bird. The men beside him were hardened, merciless. Guns at their hips, rifles strapped to their saddles. They weren't here to negotiate. Evelyn felt ice in her veins. She had known he wouldn't let her go, but some foolish part of her had hoped she had escaped him for good. That hope crumbled into dust as she watched him scan the landscape with cold, knowing eyes. Kai was already moving. He pulled her back from the ridge, his grip firm but not cruel. You run, he said. She shook her head. No. His expression darkened. They are here for you? She swallowed the lump in her throat, forcing herself to stand taller. Then I stopped running. Something flickered in Kai's gaze, something unreadable. He studied her, then the approaching riders, then her again. A choice had been made. He nodded once. The world narrowed to this moment, this place. Kai moved swiftly, wordlessly. He retrieved a second knife from his belt, pressing it into her palm. She felt the weight of it, the sharpness of the steel, and her fingers curled around it. A weapon, but also a promise. She would not be a bystander to her own fate. The hoofbeats slowed. The riders were close now. Too close. Kai knelt beside the fire pit, rubbing dirt over the embers, erasing their presence. He moved like he had done this 100 times before. Maybe he had. Evelyn forced herself to breathe. Then Carver's voice rang out, smooth and commanding. "Evelyn?" She flinched. Kai's hand closed around her wrist. A warning. A test. She inhaled sharply, steadied herself. Carver's voice came again, closer this time. "I know you're out there. And I know you're not alone." Silence. A click. A rifle being cocked. Evelyn's heart pounded as Kai shifted his stance, positioning himself between her and the approaching men. "I don't know what you think you're doing," Carver continued. "But it ends now. You belong to me." The words sent a surge of something hot and defiant through her. "Not anymore." Kai stepped forward, emerging from the shadows of the ridge. The moment stretched thin as Carver and his men reacted, hands flying to their weapons. Kai did not move, did not speak. A standoff. Carver's eyes narrowed. "You've got no business in this, Apache." Kai remained silent. Carver scoffed. "She's coming with me?" He gestured toward Evelyn, who remained behind the ridge, knife clutched in her hand. "Or, do you think you're going to keep her?" The way he said it, like she was cattle, a thing to be owned, made Evelyn's skin crawl. Kai's fingers flexed against his rifle. The world shifted, the tension razor-thin. Then it happened. A shot rang out. Kai moved before Evelyn could process what was happening, his body twisting as he fired. Chaos erupted. Dust kicked up as horses reared. Gunfire cracked through the air, sending echoes through the canyon. Kai was a blur of motion, his rifle bucking in his hands, his aim deadly. One man fell from his horse, his body hitting the dirt in a lifeless heap. Evelyn's instinct screamed at her to run, but she didn't. She wouldn't. Instead, she moved. Carver had dismounted, his pistol drawn, stalking toward Kai with ruthless precision. Evelyn felt the weight of the knife in her hand. She moved before she could think, before fear could take hold. Carver raised his pistol. Kai turned too late. Evelyn struck. The knife drove deep. Carver's eyes widened in shock as she twisted the blade, her hands steady even as her heart thundered. He made a choked sound, stumbling backward, his gun slipping from his fingers. His knees buckled. Then he was gone. The dust settled. Silence. Evelyn stood there, her chest rising and falling, her hands slick with Carver's blood. Kai watched her, his expression unreadable. The last of Carver's men turned and fled, their loyalty crumbling in the face of death. And just like that, it was over. Evelyn exhaled, her body trembling, but she did not fall. Kai stepped toward her, his gaze lingering on the knife still clutched in her fingers. "You are not the same," he said, his voice low. She met his gaze, the weight of everything crashing over her. "No." A long silence stretched between them. Then, slowly, she let the knife drop. Kai nodded once, a silent understanding passing between them. There was no going back. The desert stretched before them, vast and endless. Evelyn turned her back on the past and stepped into the unknown. Beside her, Kai walked too. Two shadows moving through the dawn.